They thought it would be just another takedown, just another black kid they could beat into silence and blame for resisting. But what those officers didn't know is who that boy's father was. Because when you lay hands on the son of the deadliest Delta Force commander this country has ever trained, you don't just cross a line, you ignite a war you can't control. What follows isn't just a story of brutality, it's a reckoning, a collision of honor, rage, and justice that unfolds in ways no one saw coming. So grab your coffee, sit back, and listen closely. Let us know what time you're watching and where you're tuning in from. Drop a comment below. We read every one. This isn't just a story, it's a wake-up call. Rain had stopped an hour ago, but the scent of damp earth and hot asphalt still clung to the open field behind the old community center, where Deshaun Carter ran alone beneath the flickering lights of the tall lampposts. Each step was a sharp rhythm against the wet gravel path, his breath steady but heavy, like he was trying to outrun something invisible and deeply personal. It wasn't unusual for him to stay late after practice. Deshaun liked the quiet, the solitude, the way his thoughts settled when the world around him slowed down. He was only 16, but already he carried himself with the careful quietness of someone who had learned to shrink his presence in certain spaces, especially when the sun dipped low and he was the only black kid left in the park. His shoes squeaked softly with every stride, water splashing underfoot, his navy track pants soaked at the cuffs. There was no music, no earbuds, just the sound of his own breath and the occasional rustle of wind through the wire fence. He had a scholarship on the line, a scout visit next month, and he needed his times to drop. That was what he told his coach. But the truth was more complicated. Running was the one thing that made him feel like he could breathe without apology. Out here in the silence, he didn't have to explain the tension in his shoulders or why his eyes always flicked toward the nearest exit whenever a siren passed. He had just finished his final sprint and was walking it off, hands on his hips, when he saw the headlights slice across the field. The gravel crunched slow and deliberate as the patrol car rolled to a stop near the bleachers. He didn't need to check who it was. He'd seen that car too many times, circling the neighborhood like a shark. He kept walking, not fast, not slow, just enough to show he wasn't doing anything wrong. But inside, a familiar chill crept up the back of his neck. "Hey," one of the officers barked, the sound cutting through the night air like a crack. "What you doing out here, son?" Deshaun turned, kept his hands where they could see them, voice steady. "Just running, sir, after practice." There were two of them, Officer Rick Dalton and Deputy Carl Boone. He didn't know them by name, but their faces had become part of the town's quiet threat. Dalton stepped out first, tall, lean eyes, sharp and restless, like he was looking for a reason. Boone stayed by the car, tapping something on his phone, but watching like a bored man looking for entertainment. "This field's closed," Dalton said, walking closer. "You trespassing." Deshaun gestured toward the building. "Coach says I can use it. Got districts coming up." Dalton didn't even glance toward the building. "You got ID on you?" "No, sir. I just live 3 blocks that way. I come here every day." Something in Dalton's jaw flexed, like the answer wasn't what he wanted. Boone chuckled under his breath from behind the open door, and Deshaun felt it, the shift. The moment when a conversation stopped being a question and started becoming a corner. He raised his hands slightly, palms up the way his father taught him long ago. "Stay calm. Don't argue. Don't reach. Don't run." "I'm not doing anything wrong, sir," Deshaun said again, more softly now. But Dalton was already stepping closer, voice louder than it needed to be. "What's that in your pocket, hands, where I can see 'em?" Deshaun froze. His phone, his keys, his student ID. He didn't move, but it didn't matter. The next second was all noise and sudden movement, Dalton grabbing his wrist, Boone closing the distance with a laugh that didn't belong here. The slap of rubber soles on wet ground. The sting of gravel against skin as Deshaun hit the dirt. He didn't fight. He didn't yell. His body curled instinctively as the first blow landed an elbow to the back, then a fist to the side of his face. Something hot burst behind his left eye. His vision swam. "Got ourselves a fast one," Boone sneered, knee pressing into Deshaun's ribs. Dalton's breath was close sour with coffee. "Always think they're above the rules." Deshaun's cheek pressed into the mud, his fingers twitching, the pain blossoming across his face, red and pulsing. He couldn't see, couldn't breathe properly, but through the haze he remembered one thing his mom always said: "Don't let them turn you into a story you didn't write." He tried to speak, tried to say he wasn't resisting, but all that came out was a broken gasp. Dalton's boot caught him in the side again, and Boone laughed like it was all just part of the job. It didn't last more than 2 minutes. They didn't arrest him, didn't call it in. They just stood there breathless and smug and walked away into the dark like nothing happened. Deshaun lay still for a while, cheek pressed to the ground, the gravel cool against the raw skin of his temple. The only sound now was the hiss of the wind and the fading echo of their boots slapping through puddles. He didn't cry, he didn't curse, but he didn't move either, not for a long time. When he finally did, he moved slowly, every breath sharp and shallow, his limbs shaking as he pushed himself upright. The field was empty again. The silence had returned, but it wasn't peaceful anymore. It was the kind that hums behind your ears when something breaks inside you. His phone buzzed in his pocket once, then twice. He couldn't see the screen, but he knew who it was. His mom. He didn't answer. He just stood there, under the light blood dripping from his nose onto his sneakers, and wondered what it would take to not feel afraid every time headlights lit the night. And then he started walking. One foot, then the next, each step heavier than the last. He didn't know what he would say when he got home. He didn't know how he would explain it again that he hadn't done anything, that he just wanted to run, that he just wanted to be left alone. But for now, he just walked. Past the broken gate, past the field, into the dark. The walk home felt longer than usual, not because of the distance, but because every movement sent a jolt of fire through Deshaun's ribs and legs. His breath came in shallow draws, catching with each step, and the cold night air clung to his torn hoodie like a second skin soaked in shame and rain. Streetlights flickered overhead, casting dim halos on the cracked sidewalk. As he passed empty yards and shuttered windows, the world around him silent, except for the slow, uneven slap of his sneakers against wet concrete. His phone buzzed again in his pocket. He didn't need to check. He knew it was his mother, probably pacing the kitchen, wondering why he wasn't home yet. He didn't have the strength to answer. Not physically and not emotionally. What was he supposed to say? They came again, and this time they didn't stop until my face hit the ground. His fingers curled slightly at the memory, not in anger, but in something closer to disbelief, a numb sort of confusion that hadn't quite settled into anything he could name. Blood trickled slowly from his lip down his chin, warm against the cold, and when he wiped it with his sleeve, it only smeared deeper into the fabric. He didn't cry. He wasn't sure he could. But his chest ached with something heavier than bruises, something that lived in the space between fear and fury, where your voice dries up before it even reaches your throat. He turned onto his block and saw the porch light glowing like always, the one his mom left on no matter how late it got. The small shotgun house stood still under the orange glow of the lamppost, the wood of the front steps warped from years of rain and sun. He climbed them one at a time, slower than usual, gripping the railing to steady himself as his legs threatened to give out beneath him. Then came the sound, quick footsteps from inside the creak of a door, and his mother's voice split through the quiet like a crack of lightning. "Deshaun," she called out already halfway out the door, the screen clattering shut behind her. "Oh my God, baby, what happened?" She rushed to him before he could answer, dropping to her knees on the porch, her hands trembling as they hovered near his face, not quite touching yet. She was still in her scrubs, a thin windbreaker pulled over her shoulders, her ID badge swinging lightly as she knelt before her son, who could barely hold himself upright. Her eyes were wide, moving over the bruises, the blood, the way he hunched over like something inside had broken. "I'm fine," Deshaun whispered, but the words were too soft, too slurred to sound convincing. "No, you're not," she snapped, but her voice broke halfway through. "Who did this to you?" He didn't answer right away. He just leaned against her shoulder, the weight of his body sagging into hers as if he'd finally run out of strength to carry it alone. She wrapped her arms around him slowly, carefully, one hand at his back, the other cradling the back of his head as she guided him inside, past the threshold, and into the narrow living room that smelled like lemon polish and lavender from the plug-in air freshener she always forgot to replace. She sat him down on the couch, pulling a blanket over his legs, her own movements a strange mix of practiced calm and barely controlled panic. Years in the ER had taught her how to treat wounds, how to ask the right questions, how to stay focused when blood was in the air. But this was different. This wasn't a stranger on a gurney or a kid from another zip code. This was her son, her baby, and he was bleeding in her arms. She reached for the first aid kit under the hallway cabinet, her fingers tight around the handle. "Tell me the truth," she said, kneeling in front of him again, pulling his hoodie back to reveal the dark bruises swelling across his ribs. "Who did this to you?" Deshaun winced at the touch of the antiseptic pad, the sting sharp enough to bring a hiss through his teeth. "Cops!" he muttered, eyes, downcast voice, barely above a breath. The word hung in the air, thick and leaden. Loretta stopped the pad still in her hand, her jaw clenching as she stared at her son's broken face. She didn't ask which cops. She didn't need to. This town only had a few, and she had seen the way they looked at her boy. Like his skin was a warning, like his silence was a challenge. They didn't even say why, he added, his good eye flickering up to meet hers. They just pulled up and started swinging. Loretta didn't speak. Not at first. She pressed a cold pack against his cheek gently, her movements now slow and deliberate. The silence between them was heavy, but not empty. It was filled with the things she didn't want to say out loud, not yet. That this wasn't the first time, that it might not be the last, that she had done everything she could to protect him, and it still hadn't been enough. "We're going to the clinic," she said, finally, her voice hard but steady. "I'm okay," Deshaun tried, but she shook her head before he could finish. "No," she said, standing up and reaching for her keys. "You're not, and I'm not letting this go." He didn't argue. He couldn't. As she helped him to his feet, his arms slung over her shoulder, he leaned into her warmth, his steps slow and uneven, as they moved together toward the old sedan parked out front. The car door creaked as she opened it, and he slid in with a low groan, resting his head against the cool glass of the window, his breath fogging the pain as the engine sputtered to life. As the car pulled away from the curb, the house growing smaller in the rearview mirror, Deshaun closed his eyes not to sleep but to block out the world for just a little longer. He didn't know what the doctor would say or what his mom would do next. But in that moment, with the sound of the windshield wipers tapping against the glass and the hum of tires rolling over wet asphalt, all he could think about was how quickly the quiet had turned violent and how impossible it now felt to ever run free again. The waiting room smelled like bleach and old coffee, a harsh mix that clung to the cracked vinyl chairs and the heavy air. Fluorescent lights buzzed overhead with a flat mechanical hum casting a sickly blue tint on Deshaun's swollen face as he leaned against his mother's shoulder, his breath shallow, his ribs aching with every shift. Loretta sat upright beside him, jaw clenched, one hand gripping the clipboard they'd been handed without a glance, the other resting gently but protectively on her son's knee. Across the room, people stared without subtlety, some curious, others cautious, one or two clearly judging, but none with the warmth or concern you'd hope to find in a place meant for healing. When they'd first walked through the doors, Deshaun barely able to stand without bracing against the wall, the woman at the front desk had barely lifted her head. Her name tag read Linda, and her lips tightened the moment her eyes landed on the bruises, the hoodie, the blood crusted at the boy's jawline. "Fill these out," she said, sliding the forms across the counter with 2 fingers like she was passing off something contagious. Loretta had tried to explain, her voice calm but sharp. He was attacked. He needs help now. But Linda just muttered something about protocol and called for the next person in line. They'd been waiting ever since. 30 minutes, then an hour, then 2. Deshaun's breathing had grown more ragged and he'd stopped trying to hide the pain. He just sat there, quiet, head low, every so often wincing when the bruises along his side flared with a cough or a shift in weight. Loretta watched the other patients come and go, an older man with a wrist brace, a woman cradling a cough with exaggerated drama, each one seen before them, each one white. "They're doing it on purpose," she whispered, leaning toward Deshaun so no one else could hear. "They see you, and they assume the worst." Deshaun didn't respond. He didn't need to. The way he avoided every pair of eyes in the room said enough. He wasn't just hurt, he was humiliated, made small in a space that was supposed to protect people. Loretta reached up to brush a piece of lint from his sleeve, a mother's instinct still finding its place in the midst of chaos. "You're not what they think," she murmured. "Don't you ever let their silence tell you who you are?" Eventually, a nurse appeared at the doorway and called his name, her tone clipped, her expression unreadable. Loretta stood first, steadying Deshaun as he rose with a groan, each step a reminder of the boots and fists that had brought him here. The hallway was narrow and cold, and the exam room they were led to looked more like an office storage closet, with a gurney shoved against the far wall. The nurse said nothing as she recorded his weight and blood pressure, jotting down numbers without looking him in the eye. Then she left, and they waited again. When the doctor arrived, he moved quickly, almost impatiently, like he was already behind on something else. He was in his 50s, balding with a tired face and a lab coat stained faintly at the cuffs. "What happened here?" he asked, eyes flicking to Deshaun's face as he reached for a stethoscope. "Police," Loretta answered before Deshaun could try. 2 officers. No explanation. Just beat him down in the middle of the track field. The doctor nodded absently, lifting Deshawn's shirt with cool fingers, pressing gently against the bruises blooming across his ribs. Fractured maybe, probably a couple, contusions everywhere, but nothing life-threatening. He scribbled something quickly, then tore the sheet from his pad and handed it to Loretta like a receipt. Painkillers. He'll need rest fluids, maybe some ice packs. No sports for a few weeks. Loretta stared at the paper, then back at the man in front of her. That's it. The doctor shrugged, already turning toward the door. He'll heal. I want to report this, she said, standing, her voice gaining edge. This was an assault. From officers of the law. I want it in his chart. But the doctor didn't stop moving. You'll have to take that up with the precinct, he said over his shoulder. We don't get involved in that here. The door clicked shut, and the silence it left behind rang louder than any siren. Deshawn lowered his shirt slowly, his hands shaking slightly from the effort. Loretta sat down beside him, the prescription sheet still crumpled in her hand, and for the first time that night she looked tired, not physically, but in the soul-deep way that comes from knowing the system is not built for your survival. On the drive home, Deshawn stared out the window, watching the city pass in slow motion, every streetlight reflecting briefly on his swollen cheek. The car was quiet, except for the soft hum of the engine and the occasional thud of tires over potholes. Loretta's hands gripped the steering wheel tighter than necessary, her knuckles pale, her eyes locked forward. They're not going to stop, Deshawn said, not looking at her. Loretta's voice was low. Then neither will I. The porch light was still on when they returned, casting long shadows on the steps where Deshawn had collapsed just hours before. She helped him inside the door, closing with a soft click that echoed through the darkened house. He settled onto the couch, curling slightly, as she adjusted the blanket over him, brushing the hair from his forehead the way she had when he was 5 and afraid of thunderstorms. Neither of them spoke for a while. The television buzzed softly in the background, left on but forgotten. Somewhere in the kitchen, the old clock ticked its way toward morning, each second marking the space between injustice and recovery. Loretta sat in the armchair across from him, still in her scrubs, still holding the torn prescription, her eyes unfocused. Deshawn blinked slowly, his good eye finding hers through the quiet. What now? He asked, voice raspy. She met his gaze, steady and sure. Now, she said, we fight. And for the first time that night, the house felt solid again, not safe, not calm, but grounded in something stronger than fear. Determination. A decision made quiet but firm, like the last word in a sentence that no one else gets to rewrite. At 4:17 a.m., Loretta Carter stood in the doorway of the small laundry room, holding her phone with both hands, staring at the screen, like it might suddenly tell her what to do. The light above her buzzed faintly, casting a yellow hue over the linoleum floor, and in the silence of the early morning, she could hear the soft, rhythmic ticking of the kitchen clock 2 rooms away. Deshawn was asleep on the couch again, finally, after hours of tossing and shallow breathing, his face turned toward the back cushions, one arm curled protectively around his ribs. She hadn't slept, not really, not since the field, not since the hospital, not since that long, cold wait in the clinic that left more questions than answers. She scrolled through her contacts, slowly, her thumb hovering over names she hadn't called in years, skipping past coworkers, church friends, and distant cousins, until she landed on one that gave her pause. Conrad Carter. She hadn't spoken to him in almost 3 years, not since the divorce finalized, and they agreed to keep things strictly about Deshawn. He was somewhere off-grid now in the Appalachians last. She heard teaching self-defense to ex-Marines or working with veterans in the mountains. She couldn't remember exactly, and truthfully, she hadn't wanted to. But now, with her son sleeping in pain, and the law twisting itself into a lie, she needed more than first aid and hope. She needed someone who understood the language of pressure. She tapped the name. The phone rang once, then twice. Then a third time before the voicemail kicked in, his voice still calm and steady after all these years. You've reached Carter. Leave it short, leave it smart. The beep sounded, and for a moment she didn't speak. She just stood there, her reflection faint in the laundry room window, her hair loose, her scrub top wrinkled her eyes, tired but unwavering. It's Loretta, she finally said, her voice low breath tight in her throat. It's Deshawn. The cops. They hurt him. Bad. They didn't arrest him, just left him bleeding in the field. His face, "Conrad, I didn't know what else to do. He's home now, but they're already rewriting it. Please just call me. I don't care about the past. I need you here." She ended the call without listening to the playback, just slid the phone into her pocket and leaned her forehead against the wall for a moment, eyes closed, letting the cool paint soothe the heat in her head. The house was still. Too still. The kind of stillness that settles in after something cracks. 1,000 miles away in a clearing nestled between two ridgelines, a satellite phone buzzed against the side of a backpack slung over a metal-framed chair. The man sitting in that chair was already awake, sharpening the edge of a camp knife with slow, practiced strokes. He paused, glanced toward the sound, then stood and crossed the clearing in long, deliberate steps. The morning mist clung to the trees like a thin veil, and birds were just starting to test the edge of dawn with faint, uncertain calls. Conrad Carter picked up the device, thumbed the screen, and saw Loretta's name. For a moment he said nothing, just let his breath slow as the message played. Her voice was tight, but it hadn't changed. Not really. It still held that steady steel beneath the panic, the kind of resolve that had drawn him to her years ago before war and distance split them apart. But it was the name, she said to Sean, that hit like a sucker punch to the ribs. He sat down on the edge of the supply crate phone, resting on his thigh, the words still echoing in his head. They hurt him. They didn't arrest him. Just left him bleeding. He stared out into the fog-draped forest, jaw-tight eyes, narrowed not with confusion but with clarity. He'd seen enough to know what came next. No one just leaves a black teenager battered in the dark without expecting him to disappear quietly. And no system rewrites the story that fast, unless it knows it's guilty. He stood again, tossed the knife into the kit, and began packing with swift efficiency: rifle, med bag, encrypted laptop, burner phones, emergency cash. The way he moved told its own story, a man who'd prepared for a call like this, even if he never wanted it to come. Within minutes the clearing was clear, the fire smothered, the tracks wiped. He didn't leave notes or explanations. He didn't say goodbye. He just slipped into the trees like a shadow, dissolving into fog. By noon he was on a private flight out of Knoxville, eyes scanning intelligence reports, fed through military back channels he never fully disconnected from. Atlanta PD, West District. Officers, Rick Dalton and Carl Boone. Complaint history, internal memos, traffic cam logs. Conrad's fingers flew across the keyboard as he pieced it together. 2 uniforms, no body cam activation. A false incident report logged 30 minutes after Deshawn's beating, already listing resisted arrest, minor force applied. He read the line twice, jaw clenched so tight it made his temple pulse. Minor force. He could still remember the first time Deshawn ran track, 8 years old, too small for the cleats, but fast, so fast and proud in that way only a kid can be before the world teaches him to hide his joy. Now that same boy was lying bruised on a couch while his name was being folded into a lie. Conrad closed the laptop, set it aside, and leaned back in the stiff leather seat. The hum of the plane vibrated through his boots, but his mind was already there in the city, mapping every street, every uniform, every name he might need to trace. Not for vengeance, not yet, but for truth and maybe something colder. As the clouds broke beneath the wings and the skyline of Atlanta stretched along the horizon, Conrad reached into his coat and pulled out a photograph, one he kept even after the divorce, tucked behind a passport in a cloth case. Deshawn at 13, holding a medal face flushed with victory, his mom's arm around him, both of them beaming in the golden light of late summer. He stared at that picture, at the life that had been theirs before the silence grew, before the miles widened, and he thought, no matter what it costs, I will not let them erase that boy. Then he slipped the photo away, sat back, and waited for the landing gear to touch down. It started with a knock at the front door, sharp, official, the kind that makes your spine tighten before you even stand. Loretta had just poured a mug of weak coffee and was reading over Deshawn's discharge papers again, tracing each line like maybe there was something she missed, something that explained how justice could walk away in uniform. She opened the door expecting a neighbor or maybe a church friend checking in, but what she found instead were 2 uniformed officers standing shoulder to shoulder, expressions blank but eyes watchful, like they were already bracing for a problem they'd helped create. Mrs. Carter, the shorter one, asked, clipboard tucked under his arm, voice too polite to trust. She nodded slowly, the coffee cup still warm in her hand. That's me. We need to speak with your son. There's been a report filed. Her brow furrowed and her hand tightened around the handle. "A report he's resting. He just got back from the clinic." The taller one shifted his tone flatter now. "We need to see him. It's about an incident at school." Deshaun was on the couch again, half asleep, a damp washcloth over his forehead, and his legs curled under the blanket. When Loretta turned, he was already sitting up, eyes squinting at the light from the open door, a flicker of anxiety crossing his face, as if his body remembered faster than his brain could. "What's going on?" he asked, his voice raspy from the swelling in his jaw. "They want to talk to you," Loretta said carefully, trying to keep her voice steady, though her gut twisted with unease. The officers stepped inside without being asked, their boots loud on the wooden floor, and the air shifted, growing tighter, colder. The shorter one unfolded the clipboard and held it up. "Deshaun Carter, you're being charged with possession with intent to distribute. A student tipped us off. You've got narcotics in your school locker." The words dropped like stones into the room, and for a moment no one moved. Deshaun blinked, then shook his head slowly, confused. "That's not possible. I don't even— What are you talking about?" Loretta stepped in front of him instinctively, her voice rising. "That's a lie. My son has never touched drugs. You're planting something." The taller officer spoke up this time, voice clipped. "Ma'am, if you continue interfering, we'll have to detain you as well." They pulled Deshaun to his feet, ignoring the way he winced, the way his legs buckled slightly under the pressure. He tried to explain, breathless, broken. "I haven't been to school since it happened. How could there be anything in my locker?" No one answered. They cuffed him before Loretta could stop them, her cries filling the room as they shoved him toward the door, his hoodie askew, his sneakers barely tied the blanket from the couch, trailing behind like a forgotten piece of home. Neighbors peeked through blinds as the squad car door slammed, and within minutes, Deshaun was gone again. This time not to a clinic, but to juvenile detention. The word possession stamped like a curse into the file that would follow him, wherever he went. Loretta stood on the porch long after they left, the morning sun creeping higher, casting long shadows across the cracked walkway. She held Deshaun's phone in her hand, his lock screen still glowing, with a photo of them smiling at his last track meet. The silence was unbearable, not because it was empty, but because it was full of everything she couldn't protect him from. Inside the precinct, an officer named Raymond Kerr stood behind a desk, typing with 2 fingers and a smirk that never quite left his lips. The locker tip had come in anonymously, the drugs already photographed, the evidence already filed. The story was airtight because it had been written before Deshaun even got to school. "Another one off the streets," he muttered to himself, sipping burnt coffee from a chipped mug. Should have kept his head down. And somewhere across town, a rookie officer stood alone in the school hallway, staring at locker 17 Hart, hammering with guilt, the bag of pills already gone from his pocket, the lie already alive in the system. He'd wanted to say no. He'd almost done it. But when Kerr looked him in the eye that morning and said, "You want a career or a conscience?" he'd chosen the path that wouldn't get him fired. Later that evening, Loretta sat in the living room again, Deshaun's backpack untouched by the door, the coffee on the counter, cold and the quiet around her now, a constant roar in her ears. She called 3 lawyers, left voicemails for 5 more, and emailed anyone with civil rights in their title. No one responded fast enough. The next morning, the local news ran a segment titled, "Teen Caught with Drugs in School Mother Blames Police Tear." They showed his school photo cropped tight around his face, the caption beneath it in red letters like a warning. The comments poured in. "Another thug. Mom making excuses. Where there's smoke, there's fire." And no one said his name with kindness. Loretta turned off the television and sat in silence, her eyes burning but dry. She knew now that this wasn't about Deshaun alone. It was about a system that didn't need evidence, only accusation. And it was about how fast that accusation could become a sentence. No judge, no jury, just a headline and a pair of handcuffs. She stood slowly, walked to the window, and watched the wind move through the trees in the yard. The branches swayed like they were trying to reach for something, or maybe trying to let go. And as she stood there, arms crossed against the chill, she whispered to no one, "They think they've buried us." Then she stepped back, took a long breath, and opened her notebook. On the top of the first page, in clear, steady handwriting, she wrote, "This is not where it ends." The cell door shut behind him with a mechanical clang that echoed too loud and too long through the concrete hallway, a sound that sank deep into Deshawn's chest and settled there like something final. The guard didn't speak, didn't offer instructions or explanations, just locked the door, turned on his heel, and disappeared down the corridor without a backward glance. The silence that followed wasn't comforting. It was thick, stale, the kind that made the fluorescent lights overhead feel colder than they should, casting a pale yellow sheen over the peeling paint and the narrow, windowless wall. The cot against the wall was nothing more than a metal slab with a stained mattress, and when Deshawn sat down, his body flinched from the contact, every bruise reminding him that he had not yet healed, not from the field, not from the betrayal, and not from the walk through the front doors of this place where his name had already become a sentence. He sat there for a long time, elbows on his knees, hands clasped together, eyes locked on the floor like it could explain something the world wouldn't too. There were voices down the hall, distant, muffled, sharp, but none directed at him, none acknowledging the boy who'd been dragged in as if justice had already been served. Deshawn didn't cry. Not because he didn't want to, but because there was something heavier than sadness sitting on his chest now, something that took the shape of disbelief and molded it into a quiet, simmering dread. It wasn't just that he'd been arrested, it was the way it had happened, the way the story had already been written before he even got a chance to speak. The food tray arrived hours later, pushed through a metal slot in the door without a word, a cold mix of mashed potatoes and some kind of gray meat that smelled like salt and sadness. He didn't touch it. His stomach churned too violently with everything else, fear, confusion, a rising sense of isolation that had nothing to do with the concrete walls and everything to do with how fast the world had turned its back on him. The first blow came before sunrise, and it didn't come with warning. Two guards, both white, both bigger than they needed to be, stormed into the cell before he was fully awake. One barked discipline check, while the other grabbed his arm and hauled him to his feet. Deshawn tried to speak, but the punch to his ribs knocked the wind from his lungs before a single word escaped. His knees buckled, and as he fell, a boot connected with the side of his leg, sending pain shooting up through his hip and spine like fire. "You don't mouth off in here," one of them growled, breath heavy with tobacco and something sour, his voice filled with the kind of joyless cruelty that doesn't need a reason to exist. Deshawn didn't fight. He curled in on himself, arms over his face, body shaking from the effort of staying conscious, of not screaming, of holding something intact inside him, even as everything outside felt like it was falling apart. When they finally left, laughing like it was routine, like they'd just completed a chore, he stayed on the floor for a long time, curled tight, the taste of blood thick in his mouth, his breath ragged and uneven. Later, when he was dragged to the infirmary, the nurse barely looked up from her clipboard. "Records say you're fine," she muttered, eyes moving over him like he was a checklist, not a person. He tried to explain, to say, "They beat me my ribs. I can't breathe," but all she did was toss a single aspirin onto the tray and wave him away. "Sit down or go back. That's all you get." He took the aspirin not because he thought it would help, but because it was the only thing in the room not staring through him like he was already gone. Word had spread through the block by the end of the day. Not the truth, the planted drugs, the lie in the report, but the story the system had whispered into the ears of the guards, the staff, the other inmates. Deshawn Carter was a snitch, a dealer, a coward who got caught and ratted to save himself. The looks followed him like shadows. In the mess hall, no one sat near him. In the shower room, silence turned to smirks and threats. "Heard you like talking," one boy hissed as he passed his tattooed fist tightening by his side. "You ain't gonna talk so much when you're on the floor." Deshawn kept his eyes down. He didn't talk. He didn't eat. He just existed, carefully, quietly, hoping not to be seen too much, but also not to disappear completely. There was no place for protest here. No room for explanations. Only the echo of the lie they had stamped on his name, spreading like smoke through a room with no windows. That night, lying on the stiff mattress with his arms crossed over his stomach, he stared at the ceiling and tried to remember what his mom's voice sounded like when she was calm. Not angry, not scared, not fighting the entire system with every breath, but just calm. Maybe on a Sunday morning when the house still smelled like coffee and the news hadn't started. He couldn't hold on to it for long, though the sounds from the hallway broke through, shouting, laughter, metal scraping against concrete. Nothing in here stayed soft for long. He turned onto his side, flinching as his ribs complained, and pulled the thin blanket tighter around his shoulders. His lips were cracked. His face was still tender, where the officer's knuckles had landed. His heart beat too fast in the quiet, and he wondered, how do I survive a place that wants me broken just for breathing? He didn't have an answer, but he knew he couldn't give them what they wanted. And so, as the fluorescent lights dimmed to their nighttime setting and the shadows grew longer along the floor, he closed his eyes not to escape, but to gather what little strength he had left. Because if this place was going to crush him, it would have to do more than lock the doors. It would have to convince him he didn't matter, and that no matter how bruised he was, it hadn't done yet. Conrad Carter stood alone beneath the dim glow of a broken street lamp, his boots planted firmly on the damp asphalt of a quiet Atlanta backstreet, the kind of place where secrets moved faster than sunlight, and the only thing louder than silence was memory. The air was thick with the smell of engine grease and stale rain, a humid blanket that clung to his skin as he adjusted the strap on his duffel bag and scanned the empty lot ahead. He'd been in this city before years ago, in a different life, in a different war, and yet the weight in his chest now felt heavier than anything he'd carried overseas. This wasn't about strategy or extraction or counterintelligence. This was about blood, his son's, and the quiet fury that had been building in his gut from the moment he heard Loretta's voice break on the voicemail. He hadn't called her back. There was nothing to say that wouldn't fall apart the moment it hit air, and besides, actions spoke clearer than apology. Instead, he spent the flight tracking badge numbers and incident logs, tapping into old contacts buried behind firewalls he once helped design. In under 3 hours, he had enough to draw a crude map of everything wrong with the department that had put hands on his son. 2 names stood out, Rick Dalton and Carl Boone, both with sealed complaints and internal reports marked resolved without detail. It was always the same pattern: excessive force, minimal consequence, victims too afraid or too tired to fight. By the time the plane touched down, he had memorized their faces and precinct schedules, and already hacked his way into the building's personnel directory from a burner laptop balanced on his knees in the back of a rideshare that didn't ask questions. Now, standing in the shadows near the rear parking lot, he watched the security camera's red light blink faintly above the back entrance, just enough to tell him it was still live, but not enough to tell him it was being monitored in real time. He crouched, slid the duffel open, and pulled out a small black device shaped like a remote control. With a quiet flick of the switch, the screen on his phone went dark, the live feed from the precinct looping a frozen frame he'd captured earlier that day. Cameras looped, he whispered to himself, voice low, and even a ritual more than a reminder. Inside, the air was stale and quiet, the kind of government building silence broken only by the occasional squeak of old shoes on tile or the distant buzz of a vending machine. He moved through the corridors like a shadow, slow and precise, every turn mapped in advance, every motion stripped of hesitation. It had been over a decade since he last operated in the field, but his body remembered what to do long before his mind needed to ask. He reached the locker room first. An old maintenance key from a retired contact had gotten him past the service hallway and slipped inside, just as a pair of officers exited, laughing too loudly, their voices trailing off into the echo of the hallway. The room was empty, lockers lined up like confession booths, the smell of sweat and old leather heavy in the air. He knelt beside one marked R. Dalton, and from his bag, retrieved a microcamera and a listening device both no bigger than his thumbnail. Within 30 seconds, the devices were planted behind the vent beneath the bench in the crease of a locker hinge, and by the time the room filled again, they would be listening. He moved next to the evidence room, not to tamper, but to confirm. The system had already flagged inconsistencies. The timestamp on the drug report filed for Deshawn's case had been edited twice, and one version showed a different signature entirely. Conrad didn't need to fabricate the truth. He just needed to let the truth breathe long enough to be heard. Down the hall, footsteps echoed. He paused, flattened against the wall, every muscle quiet, every breath shallow. 2 officers passed, neither noticing the shadow in the alcove, both complaining about schedule rotations and something about a mayor's visit next week. When their voices faded, he moved again, slipping through a side exit that led to a stairwell, his mind already running ahead to what came next. He didn't have a plan for after tonight, just a direction, and a rage sharpened into purpose. He wasn't looking for revenge, not yet. He was looking for leverage, for proof. For the kind of evidence that didn't get lost or mislabeled when the victim's skin was too dark and the story didn't fit the script the city wanted to tell. He stepped into the night again, the air cooler, now the sky heavy with clouds, the streets quieter than before. Across the lot, he saw the outline of the city courthouse, a hulking building with lights in just a few windows. It wasn't time for that place yet, but it would be soon. For now, he walked slow and steady down the cracked sidewalk that ran past the station, past the park where Deshaun once ran drills, past the storefronts still closed with handwritten signs that spoke of dreams paused mid-sentence. At a corner bench he sat, the duffel at his feet, the city around him breathing in that strange, uneasy way cities do when they're trying to forget what they've done. He leaned forward, elbows on his knees, head down, not in defeat but in focus. The streetlight above flickered once, then steadied, and in its glow his shadow stretched long behind him, quiet and unassuming. He reached into his jacket, pulled out a photo he hadn't looked at since the day Deshaun turned 13. In it, the boy was mid-laugh, arms outstretched, his sneakers muddy from a race he'd won by half a second. Conrad looked at it now, not for sentiment but for reminder. For clarity. "You're not just a kid they can make disappear," he said aloud, the words meant for no one but the night. "You're mine." And in that moment, beneath the dim orange light of a lonely corner in a city trying to bury its sins, he made a quiet vow, not of violence, not of chaos, but of return. He would not leave this city until Deshaun walked free, until the story had been set straight, until every lie they planted had been dragged, screaming into the daylight. Not because he was a soldier, not because he was angry, but because he was a father, and that had always been the only title that ever truly mattered. The storm rolled in just after midnight, low thunder, rumbling in the distance, as a fine mist began to fall over the city, softening the sharp edges of rooftops and streetlights, and turning everything to a blur of wet reflections and twitching shadows. In a narrow alley behind the juvenile detention center, the world held its breath as Conrad Carter crouched in silence, his back pressed to a brick wall slick with condensation, his hands steady despite the storm and the weight of what he was about to do. He wore black from head to toe, tactical, but not aggressive, every movement quiet, every intention deliberate. The duffel bag at his feet was heavy with gear rope, a burner laptop, an EMP grenade wrapped in a towel, and a suppressed pistol that hadn't seen daylight in years. He wasn't here to start a war. He was here to take back his son. The layout of the facility had been etched into his brain 2 nights earlier, courtesy of a former military contractor with access to state security schematics and a favor to repay. Conrad had memorized every exit, every camera, every blind spot between the rear utility gate and cell block C. Now, under cover of the wind and rain, he checked his watch once, then again waiting for the guard inside, the one who'd taken 500 in silence, and agreed to look the other way at exactly 12:07 a.m. When the lock on the rear gate clicked open, it was softer than expected, the kind of subtle shift that only someone listening for it would hear. A pale figure emerged from the shadows, skinny, nervous, reeking of bourbon and sweat, wiping his mouth with the back of a shaking hand. "You've got 10 minutes, he whispered, not making eye contact. "No more." Conrad nodded, once lifted the bag, and slipped through the gate like smoke through a crack in the wall. He moved fast, but without panic, ducking beneath the security cameras now frozen in a loop thanks to the silent pulse of the EMP grenade he'd left behind a vending machine. The hallway lights flickered once, then went dim for just long enough to mask his footsteps. Inside cell block C, the air was thicker, heavier, pulsing with the rhythm of sleeping boys and the hum of electric locks waiting to fail. He found Deshaun's cell third from the end, the narrow window in the door, too high to see through the number 117 stenciled above in peeling black paint. He pressed his hand to the door gently, as if feeling for something beyond metal. The lock mechanism was old mechanical, not digital, and gave way with a soft twist of the bypass tool he'd slipped from his boot. The door creaked open just an inch, just enough to show him the boy curled on the thin mattress, his face turned to the wall, his breathing uneven and shallow. "Deshaun," Conrad said, voice low and steady, the kind of voice he hadn't used in years, not as a soldier but as a father. The boy stirred, then sat up with a sharp inhale, his bruised hands gripping the edge of the bed, his eyes squinting in the dark. "Dad," he rasped, disbelief and pain tangled in the single word. "I'm here," Conrad said, already crossing the cell, one arm wrapping around his son's back to lift him gently from the mattress, the other reaching for the bag, already calculating weight and timing and speed. "We don't have long." "Can you walk?" Deshaun nodded, though his body told a different story, trembling barely upright every step, a protest against the damage done. "Just lean on me," Conrad whispered, and the boy did, letting his father carry what his legs could not. They moved back down the corridor, the silence broken only by the soft thud of boots and the occasional groan of the old building settling into the night. At the corner, just before the back exit, a voice shouted too loud, too close, and a flashlight beam split the hallway, cutting through the dark like a blade. "Who's there?" the guard barked, one hand already on his radio. Conrad didn't hesitate. He dropped the EMP grenade at their feet and pulled Deshawn behind a pillar as the hallway went dark with a sharp, quiet pulse. Sparks sizzled along the ceiling as the radios died, and the cameras blinked to black. In the chaos, he slipped through the exit, heart pounding, but hands still calm, leading his son back into the rain as sirens began to wail in the distance. By the time they reached the alley where the SUV was hidden beneath a tarp of discarded metal and vines, Deshawn's strength had faded again, his weight pressing heavier into his father's side, his eyes fluttering closed, despite every effort to stay awake. "Almost there," Conrad murmured, helping him into the back seat, covering him with a dry blanket and checking his pulse with fingers that hadn't lost their precision. "You're safe now. I've got you." The engine rumbled to life, muted under the rain, and they pulled away from the facility just as red and blue lights flooded the entrance gate, too late to stop the man who'd already disappeared into the city's side streets. An hour later, they reached the safe house, a cabin 20 miles south of the city, hidden in a grove of pine trees that stretched like silent sentinels into the night sky. Inside, the walls smelled faintly of cedar and dust, and the only light came from an old kerosene lamp that flickered near the window. Conrad laid Deshawn on the cot in the corner, unzipped the bag again, and began dressing the wounds with the kind of quiet focus only years of combat training could teach. His hands moved without panic, but his eyes stayed locked on his son's face, watching for signs of shock, of pain, of something worse than bruises. Deshawn stirred once, his voice barely more than a whisper. "You came." Conrad paused, looked him in the eye, and answered softly. "Always." Outside, the wind shifted, the storm finally moving east, leaving only silence and the low hum of frogs in the woods. Inside the cabin, the boy slept with one arm draped across his ribs, his breath slow but steady, and the man beside him sat, his fingers wrapped around a coffee mug gone cold, his eyes fixed on the door. Not because he expected company, but because he wasn't leaving again. Not this time. Not ever. By the time the sun broke through the thinning clouds the next morning, the city had already begun to twist the truth into something more convenient, more palatable, something that kept certain people comfortable and others invisible. Conrad stood in the living room of the cabin, shoulders squared, arms folded, watching a grainy news segment flicker on the screen of a portable television propped on a folding table. The anchor's voice was polished and confident, reading from a teleprompter with the steady cadence of someone who had no skin in the story. Juvenile suspect connected to drugs and violence escapes. Detention center public urged to remain vigilant. Law enforcement has identified his father, Conrad Carter, a former military operative with suspected ties to domestic extremist groups. Conrad didn't blink. He just stared, jaw-tight eyes flat, the muscles in his neck tense, with a rage that had nowhere left to go but deeper inside. The footage cut to an aerial shot of the detention center, then a blurry image of his SUV pulling onto a side road, its license plate blacked out, but the shape unmistakably his. The message was clear, not just to him but to anyone watching. He was no longer a father protecting his son. He was now a threat, a fugitive, a man painted in the same color as the fear they fed the public night after night. Inside the bedroom, Deshawn lay still, wrapped in a blanket on the cot, his chest rising and falling with uneven breaths, his body still recovering from both the bruises and the adrenaline crash. Loretta had taught him well how to stay calm under pressure, how to breathe through pain, how to protect his voice when no one else would, but nothing could have prepared him for how fast the world had tried to erase his story. Conrad turned the television off with a slow push of the button, the screen blinking to black, leaving behind a silence that felt heavier than the words ever did. He stepped into the bedroom doorway, watching his son sleep, one arm draped across his ribs, his face pale beneath the flicker of morning light creeping through the window blind. It struck Conrad in that moment just how fragile survival looked when you stripped away the armor. Just a boy hurt and still the hum of machines replaced by the rhythm of sleep, and yet carrying more weight than any 16-year-old should have to bear. Outside, birds moved through the branches of tall pine trees, their wings catching sunlight that hadn't yet reached the forest floor, and somewhere far off the low thrum of a helicopter began to echo through the valley. Conrad stepped out onto the porch, scanning the sky, eyes narrowing as the sound grew louder, closer, familiar. He didn't panic. He didn't move fast. He simply waited, counted the seconds between passes, calculated the pattern, then stepped back inside. "They're sweeping the woods," he said quietly, more to himself than to Deshawn, though the boy stirred slightly at the sound. "Are they looking for you? Or me?" Deshawn asked, his voice dry, cracked, but alert. Conrad walked over, poured a glass of water and held it out as Deshawn pushed himself up on one elbow, wincing slightly. "Both," he answered. "But I know how they think. They're not here yet. They're watching first, waiting for us to move." Deshawn took a sip, his hands still trembling slightly, then leaned back against the pillow, his eyes fixed on a crack in the ceiling. "Feels like they already won," he whispered. "Like it doesn't matter what we say. They'll still make it look like we're the danger." Conrad sat in the chair beside the cot, resting his elbows on his knees, hands folded. "That's what they want," he said, his voice low but steady. "They want you to believe that. Because if they can convince you that your story doesn't matter, then they don't have to hear it. And if they don't have to hear it, they don't have to answer for it." The boy nodded, slowly absorbing each word, like it was the only thing that made sense in a world that had twisted itself sideways. There was something in his expression, a quiet resilience, bruised but not broken, that made Conrad reach into his coat pocket, pull out the burner phone and power it on. "I've got the truth recorded," he said simply. "Their voices, the report edits, the internal lies. I can release it all. But once it's out there, we can't take it back, and we'll never be invisible again." Deshawn didn't answer right away. He looked out the window, watched the trees sway slightly with the morning breeze, then turned back to his father. "Then let them see," he said, soft but firm. "Let them see everything." That afternoon, from the safety of a makeshift workspace hidden beneath a false floorboard in the cabin, Conrad uploaded the first wave of files, body cam footage that had been erased but not fully deleted. Audio from private squad room conversations, time-stamped reports that contradicted official statements. A photo of Deshawn's bruised face taken by a nurse who thought no one would notice she'd saved a copy to her own email, all compiled into a simple folder marked with the words, "Justice starts here." He sent it to 3 journalists, 2 civil rights organizations, and a secure archive stored on an encrypted server located in Europe. Then he sat back, watched the upload bar crawl to completion, and closed the laptop with a quiet finality. Outside, the wind picked up, brushing loose pine needles across the porch, and the sky darkened again, not with storm, but with something heavier, a shift in air, a pressure that spoke of change on the horizon. Conrad stood, stepped into the doorway once more, and breathed in the damp, electric scent of possibility. Behind him, Deshawn sat at the table, eyes scanning the screen of a cracked tablet, reading comments under a photo of his own face posted by one of the reporters who'd broken the story. Some were ugly, some were cruel, but some for the first time were simply listening, and that in itself was enough to begin. Under the muted gray sky of early dawn, Conrad stood on the back porch of the cabin with a mug of black coffee cooling in his hand, his breath visible in the crisp morning air. A faint mist rose off the pine trees beyond the yard, the earth still damp from the night's rainfall, and the hush of the forest stretched in every direction, like nature was holding its breath. Inside, Deshawn still slept curled beneath the quilted blanket that smelled faintly of cedar and old tobacco, his face calmer than it had been in days, the furrow in his brow finally beginning to ease. But Conrad couldn't sleep, not yet, not until he knew what came next. The video had gone live overnight, and the world was waking up to the truth. But truth alone didn't offer protection, not when systems were designed to ignore it. He checked his watch, then stepped inside the floorboards, creaking softly under his boots, as he moved to the small kitchen table, flipping open the burner phone to find a single new message. "Meet at 9. Quiet. Use side entrance." It was from Monique Vargas, a civil rights attorney with fire in her blood and a history of lighting matches where injustice festered. She didn't speak in long sentences, she didn't have time, but when she said quiet, she meant no tale, no tech, no mistakes. Conrad poured out the cold coffee, rinsed the cup with shaking hands, then sat down to write a note for Deshawn, short, clear, and just enough to tell him not to worry. By 8:10 a.m. he was in the car again, winding through forest roads still slick with fallen leaves, the tires humming low against the asphalt. His thoughts were loud though, a relentless mix of planning and memory of what might come and what already had. He remembered the night Deshaun was born, how his cries were the first sound Conrad had truly let break him open since the battlefield. How for one fragile moment it had felt like the world had paused just long enough to give something back. Now that boy had been broken in a system that still didn't see him as a child, still saw his skin before his name. Monique's office was a converted brownstone in the heart of the old district, tucked between a shuttered bookstore and a halal deli that always smelled like cumin and slow-cooked lamb. He parked in the alley as instructed, took the back stairwell 2 steps at a time, and entered through the rusted fire door into a hallway lined with faded legal flyers and mismatched chairs. She met him in the doorway with eyes that had seen too many stories like his, and a voice sharpened by decades of courtroom wars. "They're coming for you," she said without ceremony. "But you've got leverage, enough to stall. Maybe even enough to win." He nodded, taking the seat across from her desk, laying the second hard drive on the table like a card in a poker game. "This one has the call logs, dispatch records, and body cam audio from Boone and Dalton. They weren't just roughing him up, they were laughing while they did it." Monique reached for the drive with careful hands, her jaw tightening slightly. "I'll get this to the DA's liaison. Off the record for now, but there's a hearing scheduled already. Juvenile Release Board. 2 days from now." 2 days, Conrad echoed, his voice low but edged. "They're dragging their feet. They're buying time," she replied, trying to control the fallout. There was a pause, long and loaded, and then she asked, "Are you ready to testify if they try to bury this?" He didn't answer right away. He stared out the window, watching a pigeon land on the windowsill, its wings fluttering once before it settled. "I didn't break him out just to run," he said finally. "I broke him out because no one else was going to protect him. But I'm not hiding. Not anymore." She nodded once. "Then we fight." By the time Conrad returned to the cabin that afternoon, the wind had picked up, rustling the treetops like whispers passing between giants. Deshaun was awake, sitting at the kitchen table, a half-eaten bowl of cereal in front of him, the television playing low in the background. His eyes found his father's, instantly questioning, alert but calmer. "You went into town?" he asked, not accusing, just curious. Conrad nodded, tossing his keys on the counter. "Met with a lawyer. She's going to help." Deshaun didn't smile, but he nodded too quietly, chewing another spoonful before speaking again. "People are talking about the video. My name's trending." "I know," Conrad said softly. "That's why we need to be ready. This isn't just about surviving anymore. It's about being heard." The boy leaned back in the chair, eyes scanning the table, hands twitching slightly with leftover tension. "I'm scared," he admitted. Conrad sat beside him, placing one steady hand on his son's shoulder. "You don't have to be brave every second. You just have to keep standing. And I'll be right here while you do." Outside, the wind rattled the shutters, the sky shifting into deeper grays, and somewhere in the woods, a branch cracked under the weight of time and weather. But inside the cabin, something held something small, but solid, the quiet formation of a line in the sand. Father, son, truth, and the long breath before the next storm. By the time evening sank its weight across the treetops and painted the cabin walls in deep orange, Conrad could feel something shift in the air. Not the wind or the scent of pine, but something more instinctive, more urgent, the kind of tension a seasoned soldier could read in the silence between moments. He had felt it before, on the edge of ambushes in foreign jungles and broken cities, in the stillness before a breach, in the way birds grew suddenly quiet and radios snapped with static. It wasn't paranoia. It was pattern recognition. Deshaun sat on the floor by the fireplace, sketching something in a spiral notebook, his knees drawn up, pencil moving softly against the page. He hadn't asked to go outside all day, hadn't touched the burner phone, just watched the flames flicker and chewed on silence like it might reveal some answer his father couldn't give him. Conrad poured a glass of water, watched the ripples shift under the flickering ceiling light, then walked to the window and tilted the blind with 2 fingers. Across the tree line, about 150 yards out, something flashed, brief, rhythmic, faint. Not lightning, not fireflies. Infrared scatter, surveillance. Someone was watching them, someone who didn't want to be seen but didn't realize Conrad had spent 20 years spotting the invisible. He set the glass down without drinking and reached for the satchel tucked behind the couch, checking the contents with methodical hands: tactical flashlight, suppressor, small caliber revolver, thermal blocker, and a second phone dead until now. He turned to Deshawn and knelt slowly, his voice low but clear. "Hey, listen to me for a second. We might have company watching from the woods. You see anything strange out the window?" Deshawn looked up, not panicked, just alert, like his father's calm was a map he'd memorized. "I saw some lights maybe half an hour ago, but I thought it was a plane." "It wasn't. I want you to stay inside away from the windows, and if anything loud happens, glass breaking, people yelling, you go out the hatch under the bathroom sink." Straight shot to the creek bed. The boy swallowed hard, nodded once, and asked, "You going alone?" Conrad nodded. "They're just watching. I'll make sure they stay that way." Outside, the forest had gone dense with shadow, the trees packed close like silent witnesses. Conrad moved with the precision of someone who had mapped this land 100 times in his mind, boot treads low to the ground, steps placed only where pine needles softened the sound. At the 100-yard mark, he crouched behind a fallen log and scanned with the thermal monocular. 2 figures. One prone with a long lens camera. Another farther left, likely armed, the barrel catching low light as it adjusted. Too professional for civilians, too quiet for reporters. He didn't draw his weapon, not yet. Instead, he picked up a rock smooth and fist-sized and hurled it 10 yards to the right with a snap of his arm. The crack in the brush drew both their eyes just long enough. Conrad flanked hard, left circled in a crescent, and came up behind the rear figure without a sound, the suppressor cold against the side of the man's neck. "Don't move. Don't talk. Drop the scope." The figure froze. The other one looked up too late. Conrad kicked his knee from behind and drove him to the forest floor with a thud that muffled into moss. "Who sent you?" he asked, voice like gravel wrapped in steel. The man groaned. "Press. Freelancer. Just photos." Conrad reached for the badge, clipped to the vest, checked the laminate, then scanned the face beneath the night vision goggles. Young, shaking, real fear. "You came here to chase a story and you damn near walked into something you weren't ready for," he said quietly. "Pack up, now. You get 15 minutes to disappear, and if I see a drone overhead after that, I'll assume it's not just the media that's looking." They didn't argue. They just nodded, grabbed their gear, and melted back into the dark, one of them limping slightly. When Conrad returned to the cabin, his boots muddy and hands cold, Deshawn was waiting at the door with the emergency pack on his shoulder already zipped. "They're gone," Conrad said. "Just press this time. But there'll be more, and louder." Deshawn leaned against the doorframe, not speaking for a long moment, then asked, "Do we keep running?" Conrad looked at him, really looked, and saw not the boy who had been hurt, but the young man who had stayed standing even after everything. "We hold the line," he said. "Just long enough for the truth to do its job." They sat together by the fireplace that night, not speaking much, just letting the firelight wash over their faces as the world outside twisted itself to catch up. Neither of them slept easily, but both of them understood that sometimes holding your ground wasn't about weapons or noise, it was about knowing exactly when to stay still and when to be seen. And in the glow of the last ember, Conrad looked over and saw his son finally resting, not because the danger was gone, but because he trusted his father to stand in the space between. The sun had barely broken the horizon when Conrad stepped out into the biting cold, his boots crunching softly on frost-laced gravel, the woods still wrapped in mist like a breath the earth hadn't yet exhaled. The cabin stood behind him silent, and still a temporary haven that now felt more like a trap, its familiarity beginning to wear thin under the weight of tension that neither sleep nor distance could erase. He scanned the tree line without moving his head, just his eyes trained and seasoned, measuring shadows, not for comfort, but for patterns, because that was how you stayed alive long after most people thought it safe to stop watching. Inside, Deshawn was waking up slowly, rubbing sleep from his eyes, dragging his legs off the couch where he'd finally dozed off after midnight. The boy's body still carried the bruises from days ago, the swelling mostly gone, but the ache buried deep in the muscle, stubborn and lingering. He moved carefully now, not from fear, but from the kind of wisdom you didn't earn through lectures or books, but through pain one hit at a time. His hoodie hung loose over his frame, and the look on his face was one of silent calculation, like he was trying to decide whether the day ahead would demand a fight or a disguise. "You slept?" Conrad asked, not turning around as he spoke. "Some," Deshawn replied, voice hoarse. "Kept waking up thinking I heard dogs." "It was just the wind." Conrad gave a single nod. They're using sound as pressure, not contact. Yet, Deshawn walked over, poured a glass of water, and leaned against the counter. How long you think before they stop circling and start kicking doors? They won't come while it's still quiet out here, Conrad said. They want to control the narrative, and bodies in the woods don't play well on the evening news. There was a pause, and then Deshawn asked, "So what do we do? Wait them out, burn this place and run?" "We hit back," Conrad said, simply pulling a folded map from his jacket and laying it on the table. But not with guns, with exposure. The plan was desperate, but so was the timeline. At noon, they would drive into town, not through the main road, but the maintenance path that skirted the south ridge, abandon the truck behind the shuttered grain mill, then enter the courthouse through the service, access known only to staff and a few retired city workers. Their goal wasn't to confront. It was to show up to be visible in the most public, undeniable way possible. Because if you vanished, they wrote your story for you. But if you stood up and showed your wounds in front of the right lenses, they had to explain themselves. Deshawn watched the plan unfold on paper, tracing each marker with quiet focus. If they recognize us at the door, we don't get 10 feet inside. They will, Conrad said, and that's the point. Just after 11, with a burner phone in the glove box and a dash camera running, they rolled out Conrad at the wheel, Deshawn in the passenger seat, both dressed like nothing was wrong, like this was just another day in a country that claimed to love freedom but flinched when it saw it in the wrong skin. The drive was quiet. No radio, no small talk. Just the hum of tires on cracked pavement, and the weight of what couldn't be said, that this might not work, that this might end with sirens, or worse, that walking into fire was the only way to stop the smoke from becoming the story. They arrived at the courthouse parking lot 5 minutes before the lunch crowd slid into a spot between two delivery vans and walked in through the side entrance with steady steps and unflinching eyes. The security guard looked up, startled at first, then narrowed his gaze and reached for his shoulder radio. Conrad didn't flinch. "I'm here with my son. You're live on 6 feeds. We're not running." The guard hesitated, thumb hovering over the call button, eyes flicking toward the hallway camera, then back again. "They're gonna want to see ID." "You'll have it," Conrad said. "But make sure you say it right when you call it in. Say the father and the boy you all framed are standing at the east entrance, unarmed, public." The guard said nothing else. Just turned and walked, radio crackling as he vanished into the side corridor. For 8 minutes they stood in the marble-lined lobby, bathed in fluorescent light, and the metallic drone of a vending machine, while clerks passed by and stared and whispered, unsure whether to treat them like ghosts or news or both. Then the doors opened, and Monique Vargas stepped inside, suit, sharp phone in hand, presence bigger than the space around her. "You made it," she said, breath tight. "You sure about this?" "No," Deshawn said before his father could answer. "But I'm tired of being just a headline." They walked through the double doors together, past deputies and stenographers, and one stunned DA assistant who nearly dropped his coffee into the chamber where the juvenile release board was supposed to meet behind closed doors. The room went quiet as they entered, every sound sucked out by the force of presence of living proof of bruises that couldn't be explained away in spreadsheets. Monique stepped forward and cleared her throat. "We request an open hearing, on record, with press presence." One of the board members blinked hard. "That's not protocol." "No," she said, "but neither is beating a 16-year-old into unconsciousness and then charging him with obstruction." No one moved for a long moment, and then slowly, reluctantly, the man nodded. "Fine, open session. Begin at 1:30. Back outside in the late afternoon wind, Deshawn leaned against the rail and exhaled slowly. The air felt different now, not because it was safe, but because it was his. Not because justice had been served, but because he had demanded to be seen. And in that quiet moment, with the city buzzing just beyond the courthouse walls, the boy who had been hunted sat still, shoulders heavy, yes, but upright, breathing, present, and no longer hidden. As the sun dipped behind the low rooftops of Redstone County, a golden hue spilled through the courthouse windows, catching dust in the air like slow-moving embers suspended in time. The echo of distant heels and creaking wooden benches filled the hallway, while the faint hum of old radiators murmured beneath the tiled floor. Conrad sat on the bench outside Chamber B, with his elbows on his knees, hands clasped, eyes steady but not still. He wasn't restless, he was measuring time, the way only someone who'd waded through sieges and surveillance could. His breathing was deep and controlled, but his mind flicked like a projector scanning through 1,000 contingencies trying to anticipate the shape of the room, the weight of the words, and the look on his son's face when it was finally over. Deshaun stood nearby, staring at the vending machine, as if he cared about choosing between pretzels or peanuts, but his hands were clenched inside the front pocket of his hoodie. It wasn't hunger that drew his eyes to the machine, it was the need for stillness, something static to stare at, while his stomach flipped and his pulse reminded him he was alive and afraid at the same time. He had spoken in public before school debates, a few youth panels, but this was different. This was a room full of people who didn't believe him, maybe didn't even see him as a full person, just a case, a risk, a story to be managed. That kind of attention didn't feel like light, it felt like a scalpel. Monique came around the corner with a folder under her arm and a calm that Conrad knew was more armor than peace. She handed a printed statement to Deshaun and placed her other hand on his shoulder gently. "You don't have to read it word for word," she said. "It's just there if you freeze. But speak your truth. That's what matters." Deshaun nodded slowly, mouth dry, shoulders rising slightly as he inhaled. "Are they gonna look at me the whole time?" he asked, not quite whispering. "They are," she said, "but they don't get to own what they see." At 1:28, the courtroom doors opened, and they stepped into a space lined with polished wood and quiet tension. The chairs were half-filled, media in the back, 3 board members at the front, and an assistant DA off to the side, pretending to look disinterested while clenching a pen so tightly it might snap. Cameras were allowed now, but only local press. Still, their presence changed the texture of the room. Words mattered more when they echoed. Deshaun walked to the center table with a calm that was heavier than it looked. His steps were slow but sure, and when he turned to face the panel, the light caught the faint purple just above his left cheekbone, a bruise not fully faded, not yet ready to be forgotten. He didn't speak immediately. He just looked at them, then looked past them, then back again, as if making sure he could hold their gaze without giving up anything of himself. "My name is Deshaun Walker," he began, voice low but clear, "and I'm not here today because I broke the law. I'm here because someone broke me." There was a pause long enough to let that settle. "I didn't resist arrest. I resisted being called a thug, being treated like a threat before I said a word. I resisted having my arms pinned behind my back while someone's boot pressed my face into concrete." The room didn't shift, but the silence tightened. "I'm not proud of what happened next, running, hiding, being scared, but I don't regret it either. Because if I hadn't, I wouldn't be standing here now. And I think deep down, some of y'all know I never should have had to run in the first place." His hands trembled slightly, but he didn't reach for the paper. He just took a breath and went on. "I didn't come to make a scene or accuse every badge in this town. But someone's gonna have to ask why a 16-year-old boy had to be filmed getting stomped before anybody cared enough to ask if he was okay. Someone's gonna have to ask why they charged me with obstruction and not the cops with assault." The panel didn't respond. They took notes. They blinked. One woman cleared her throat but said nothing. "I'm not perfect," Deshaun added, softer now, "but I've got dreams. I've got a dad who taught me how to fight with my words, not my fists. And I've got scars now, not just on my skin, but here," he tapped his chest, "that remind me how easy it is to disappear if you're not loud enough to be seen." When he finished, he didn't look down. He just stood there, steady, as if daring the silence to mean something. Conrad watched from his seat, heart full but still. Pride wasn't the word, there was something older than pride in that moment, something like reverence, the quiet awe of seeing your child walk through fire and still come out carrying someone else's torch. The board thanked Deshaun and the room softened. Monique stood to speak next, pivoting to facts and legal precedent, but it no longer felt like that was what mattered most. The truth had already been spoken. Everything else was administration. As they exited the courtroom into the fading light of late afternoon, Deshaun let out a long breath, the kind that pulls up something heavy from your chest and leaves space where fear used to sit. Conrad put a hand on his back and nodded once. "You did good," he said. "Wasn't just me," Deshaun replied. "You taught me how to stay standing." They walked together across the cracked pavement of the courthouse, steps past cameras, past whispers, past eyes that would remember them differently now. And as the sky turned a little darker, the weight on their shoulders felt lighter, not because the fight was over, but because they had finally made it undeniable. The motel room smelled faintly of bleach and old carpet, the kind of scent that settled into the walls and lingered indifferent to who came or went. A ceiling fan spun lazily overhead, clicking once every few rotations like a metronome out of rhythm. The television was on mute, flashing images of the evening news. Politicians shaking hands afire somewhere in Colorado, a local story about school lunches. Conrad didn't look up. He was seated at the small desk near the window, his laptop open, a charging cable running beneath the chair, and a burner phone plugged in beside it. His eyes weren't on the screen, though. They were fixed just beyond the cracked blinds, watching headlights roll past on the highway outside. Deshaun lay on the second bed, half covered by a threadbare comforter, earbuds in but no music playing. He was listening to silence, to the sound of his own thoughts, clawing for space, trying to decide which of them were safe to believe. Every hour that passed without a knock at the door felt like a small victory, but also like a warning, because if it was quiet too long, something was always coming. He'd started learning that from his dad, but now he was learning it firsthand. "You said they'd respond by now," Deshaun said, eyes still on the ceiling. "That the footage would force their hand." "They will," Conrad replied. "But not because they care, because they're calculating." Deshaun sat up slowly, resting his elbows on his knees, the ache in his ribs easing now into a dull memory. "So what happens next?" Conrad looked at him, tired but focused. "We make sure they don't get to change the ending." He turned the laptop screen toward Deshaun. A paused video showed the courtroom steps, the boy standing with a microphone, the bruise still visible, the crowd silent behind him. On the edge of the frame, a news anchor's shoulder peeked in, holding out a mic like it was an olive branch. It had aired the night before on local news, picked up briefly by national syndicates, then just as quickly disappeared under the avalanche of newer stories. But somewhere in that flood, a spark had caught. The video had been shared by a retired judge, then a civil rights attorney, then a military blog that recognized Conrad's face and captioned it, "Delta doesn't raise cowards." Now every hour brought a different kind of attention. Anonymous tips, messages from old allies, even a cryptic voicemail that simply said, "We see you. Keep moving." Deshaun watched the video again, then leaned back. "It's weird watching myself talk. I remember it different. It felt smaller in my head." "That's how you know it was real," Conrad said. "You weren't performing, you were surviving." Outside, a truck engine rumbled past headlights, sweeping briefly across the window, casting shadows like prison bars across the walls before fading again. Deshaun stood and walked to the sink, splashed cold water on his face, and stared at his reflection in the mirror. The swelling was gone now, but a faint red line ran just below his left eye like a reminder carved into skin. He traced it absently, then turned. "What if they offer us a deal?" he asked. "What kind of deal?" "Drop the charges, private settlement, gag order." Conrad shook his head slowly. "That's not justice. That's hush money dressed in paperwork." "I know," Deshaun said, "but part of me still wants to say yes." He wasn't ashamed of it. He was tired. Tired of being the symbol, of being strong, of holding his chin up every time someone whispered troublemaker like it was his real name. He wanted peace, but not the kind they were offering. "We'll listen," Conrad said. "Then we'll decide. Together." That night they didn't sleep much. The wind picked up around 3 a.m., whistling through the broken weather stripping, making the door rattle in its frame. At one point, Deshaun sat up and asked Dad, "When did you stop being scared?" Conrad, already awake, looked over from the other bed. I just stopped letting it make the decisions." They met the next morning with a civil attorney named Bishop Harlan, an old friend of Conrad's from a deployment 15 years back, now grayer and heavier, but sharp as ever. He arrived in a rusted Ford, stepped into the motel room without shaking hands, and opened his briefcase before anyone offered him coffee. "I can make this go two ways," he said, eyes flicking between father and son. "The clean way or the honest way?" "Explain," Conrad said. "The clean way gets the charges dropped, wraps this in red tape, and gets you on a plane to somewhere quiet with a modest check and a confidentiality clause. And the honest way, you tell your story, loud enough that they can't bury it, but it won't be safe, it won't be easy, and it might get worse before it gets better." Deshaun was the one who answered, "I don't need quiet. I need the truth to matter." Harlan nodded, closed the briefcase. "Then we start tonight. I've got a journalist from New York willing to listen. Off the record for now, but she has reach." As he left, Conrad looked at his son, not with worry, not with pride, but with a clarity that only fathers who've seen war and raised children understand. A look that said, "I trust your voice more than I trust their system." And as the sun rose through the motel curtains, catching in the cracks of the old wallpaper, Deshaun picked up the phone, cleared his throat, and began to tell the story again, not because he had to, but because it was his. The church bells rang low that morning, deep and deliberate, echoing off the quiet streets of Redstone as if the town itself had paused to listen. There were no sirens today, no shouting, no helicopters overhead. Just the solemn cadence of a community holding its breath. The sun hung just above the rooftops, casting long golden beams through the stained glass windows of St. Augustine's, painting the pews in crimson and sapphire. Inside it was silent, save for the shuffling of polished shoes and the rustle of hands folded in prayer. The air was heavy with incense, but beneath it lingered something older, grief tempered by dignity. Deshaun sat in the second row beside his father, their shoulders almost touching, both dressed in tailored black suits that felt too stiff for comfort but just right for the moment. He hadn't spoken much that morning, not since the early hours when he'd looked into the mirror and barely recognized the man staring back. Something had shifted, not broken, but realigned. A part of him had been stripped away and rebuilt in the fire of public scrutiny, and now he carried it not like a burden, but like armor. He glanced at his father, who gave him a nod, not of approval, not of pride, but of recognition. "You made it," the look said. "You're still here." The Reverend stepped up to the podium, voice calm, weathered, and full of authority. "We are gathered here not just to mourn, but to remember. Not just to remember, but to stand." His words filled the room, but they didn't settle, they stirred. Each person present had seen the footage, had heard the screams, had read the statements, and sworn affidavits. They knew the boy on that video was the same young man sitting quietly in their midst, and they had come not out of pity but out of quiet reverence. Because sometimes, survival in a world like this is its own kind of protest. After the service, people lingered outside, sunlight washing over the steps, casting long shadows that touched the edge of the street. Deshaun shook hands. He didn't recognize accepted hugs. He didn't expect, and nodded through stories of other sons, other fears, other prayers whispered in the dark. There were mothers with tired eyes, veterans with stiff backs, teenagers with folded arms and questions in their throats. And through it all, Deshaun stood firm, not defiant, not cold, just present. Grounded. Conrad watched from a few feet away, arms crossed, eyes scanning the crowd like he had on patrol years ago. Not paranoid, just trained. There was a difference. When Monique stepped beside him, he didn't turn, but he softened. "He held it together better than I ever could have at that age," he said quietly. "He had to grow up faster than you did," she replied. "That changes a boy." They didn't say much after that. Words weren't necessary when history hung so close. Instead, they stood side by side as reporters circled at a distance, unsure whether this was a moment for questions or silence. One finally approached a young woman with a notepad and cautious eyes. "Mr. Walker," she asked softly, "what do you hope people take away from all this?" Deshaun paused, looked past her toward the old courthouse at the end of the street, then back again. "That we're not asking to be seen as saints," he said. "Just human. Start there." That night they burned the old hoodie. It wasn't a ceremony. There were no cameras, no speeches. Just the three of them in the backyard behind Monique's house, beneath the wide expanse of stars and the rustling of wind through oak trees. Conrad built the fire low and slow like he'd been taught, and Deshaun tossed the hoodie into the flames without hesitation. It caught quickly, curling at the edges, the fabric blackening into smoke and then disappearing entirely. No one spoke until it was nearly ash. "Feels strange," Deshaun said, finally, arms folded across his chest. "What does?" Monique asked. "Letting go of something that was part of who I was, even if it was a part I didn't choose." Conrad stirred the coals gently, watching the last sparks rise into the dark. "Some things you bury, others you burn. But either way, you move forward." Deshaun didn't answer. He just watched the flames die down, the orange glow fading into embers, the silence wrapping around them like a blanket. And in that quiet, something settled, not closure, not peace, but the shape of a new beginning. Later that night in the room he'd once called his own, Deshaun sat by the window and wrote in the margins of a worn notebook. Not a statement, not a speech, just thoughts, hopes. The kind of things a young man writes when he knows the world is watching but still wants to claim something just for himself. He didn't know if it would ever be read. That wasn't the point. Across the hall, Conrad slept lightly, one arm over his eyes, the other resting beside the nightstand where an old photograph of his unit leaned against a dusty lamp. He dreamed not of battlefields or missions, but of laughter of a boy chasing fireflies across a summer lawn, calling out to be seen, and a father watching with a heart full of quiet wonder. Outside, the wind shifted, carrying the last scent of smoke into the night, and somewhere in the hush that followed, a new story waited to be lived. Chat GPT Darnoy. In life there are moments when survival itself becomes an act of courage, and simply standing your ground is a form of protest. This story reminds us that healing doesn't always come with noise. It can begin in silence, in the quiet choice to keep going when the world feels heavy. For those of us who've lived long enough to see history repeat itself, this tale is not just about a boy and his father. It's about legacy, dignity, and the power of choosing what to carry forward and what to leave behind. It's never too late to stand for something greater than yourself. Whether you're fighting for justice, protecting your family, or simply choosing peace over bitterness, the lesson here is clear. Your story still matters, and your strength, quiet, steady, unshakable, can light the way for those who come after. So wherever you are today, whatever you're facing, remember this. Sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is look back without fear and step forward with purpose. If this story moved you or reminded you of the strength it takes to keep going, especially when the world tries to push you down, don't forget to give this video a like. And if you believe in stories that honor truth, dignity, and the quiet power of resilience, hit that subscribe button. We share more than just headlines here. We share voices that matter. Stay with us, because every story like yours deserves to be heard.